actually involve people in morality when the questions themselves aren't understood. Not even going to understand the disabilities that you would want to fix. People with disabilities more visible, and they're not the butt of jokes as people with human rights.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining RESO, Dr. Marine from Ireland, and it's a wonderful possibility to have different experts sort of covering research and academic dimensions, and you're also working fellow at Oxford Center for Animal Ethics. It's a wonderful possibility for us to have academicians and researchers. And again, thanks a lot for joining. Would like to start with my first question, important question. We're going to cover biotechnology, and says like informed consent we're talking about. How can medical practitioners ensure that patients fully understand and consent the complex biotechnology treatment residencies, specifically in the context of therapies we're talking about?
Well, it's an absolute minefield because like what I did my PhD on was on patents, biotechnology, and the question of morality. And in European law, now I don't say EU law because we've got a very, very complex patent system in Europe with about 4 different regimes. So you've got national, EU level, you've got the European Patent Organization, and so then, and like there are international patents that you can get as well. So there are morality questions that differ at every level. And I did a specialization on this, and I was talking about how you actually involve people in morality when the questions themselves aren't understood. So, and obviously the patents are got in order to encourage companies to research on certain therapies. Well, the average person who comes in to get an operation or to get some sort of therapy, they're not even going to understand the technology. So informed consent is extremely, extremely difficult. Like, even if you've got a degree in science, you do need some background in science if you're looking at the law in this area as well. So, informed consent is, how deep do you expect to go? It's absolutely impossible. A lot of people aren't very happy about vivisection, but there's no choice in for example, that there's testing on animals involved. Most people aren't aware of the fact that a lot of the mice used now in vivisection, they're genetically engineered. And there have been some famous cases on that, like the case of the oncomouse, which it was a mouse that was predisposed to get cancer. And Harvard University got a patent. And they then applied to the European Patent Organization, which covers 38 states. So it's the EU, 27 states, plus another 11 states that are outside of the European Union. Britain, for example, other countries like Norway isn't a member. There's several other countries like that around Europe. So they applied for that. And the thing about Europe, because politically it's very diverse, Greenpeace and other green groups are very powerful, and they mount a lot of challenges, and there's also an opposition procedure, so they can take opposition proceedings. So they did oppose the patent, and it went on for so long that the patent was eventually abandoned. It was continuously narrowed because originally it was very broad. It was covering many more mammals than just a mouse, right? So there were ethical issues involved in that, but the mouse was genetically engineered. So a lot of animals that are used in vivisection now, they're biotechnological inventions. They've got human genes. Even if, you wouldn't be asked to consent to that aspect of the biotechnological invention. And even if you did, there's no alternative. So you're probably not going to opt against it. So informed consent is a very, very difficult issue indeed. Because again, the average person, if you go to the average person on the street and you ask them what biotechnology is, they don't have a clue. And I teach biotechnology and patents to undergraduate and postgraduates at my university, and there isn't any knowledge about medical technologies or biotechnology among an educated student class, adults and young adults.
No.
You wouldn't be asked whether you're consenting to a biotechnological procedure or invention or anything like that. And actually, I'm supervising a PhD at the moment, and he's doing his PhD on patents and biologics. And I actually didn't know what biologics were when he came, and he started the PhD at the beginning.
So having informed about informed consent, it's important for us to, we've thrown lights on important areas and concerns. Thanks a lot. Would like to move on to my second question. One question says, genetic modifications, is it morally acceptable to understand and should have used biotechnology to alter an unborn child's genetic traits?
This is a huge ethical question. The first thing is that our technologies don't allow us to pick up a lot of the disabilities that you would want to fix. Okay? So there's a big difference in the way in which this issue is treated in Britain and in Ireland. So Ireland has only really recently liberalised its law on abortion. So beforehand, if your pregnancy, like if you were pregnant and you had a fetus that was suffering from Down syndrome, then in Ireland you would have the child. And what's happened is that the way in which we treat children with disabilities has changed. And it's changed because of the International Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. So I think that what that did was it made people with disabilities more visible, and they're not the butt of jokes anymore. They're seen as people with human rights. And we've had a lot of events like the Special Olympics that showcase their abilities. Now, in Britain, it's a very different scenario. So if a woman is carrying a child or a fetus and they've got Downs, she comes under a huge amount of pressure to have an abortion. And I've spoken to a medical coroner about this just in terms of the statistics. And I said, is it true that like about 99% of fetuses with Downs are aborted in the UK? And he said, no. He said it's more. So basically, it's a kind of, well, I suppose it's a sort of eugenics of screening out. And I don't say that in necessarily in a judgmental way, because obviously there are huge issues for people who go ahead with such pregnancies. But one of the big issues that's used to inform women in that situation is that there are no services. But of course, there are no services if there are no children being born with a disability. And that screening, it picks up very little. So there's some genetic abnormalities that you can fix. There are a lot of others that you can't fix, and they can result in much more challenging behaviour. And I think what we're hoping to see in Ireland is, because we haven't had a tradition of screening out people with Down syndrome, they're visible and they're now much more integrated in society. And it's only really for the difference in the physical appearance that sometimes you even pick up that somebody has got Downs at all. And there's a lot of, I suppose, change in the way in which we see people with disabilities. So we don't necessarily always talk about autism as a disability now. We see it as a spectrum of human behaviour. Autism can't be picked up. And then the other thing too is, if we get to the point where we're going to fix everything, does that then have a knock-on effect on perhaps causing other unforeseen illnesses? And I suppose it raises a bigger question of, how do we envisage our society? Like, what are we actually correcting? So there are obvious diseases like Huntington's disease, for example, that if that could be genetically corrected, it would be a fantastic thing. And I think they're doing experiments on that in the UK. So they've created beings with 3 parents as opposed to 2. That obviously it raises a lot of ethical issues, you know, of people who don't want our medicine to go in that direction. So yeah, It's, as I say, it's absolutely an ethical minefield. When we talk about fixing things, what is it that we want to fix? And I think that we need to have a much broader societal discussion about how we see humanity.
Thanks a lot for responding this important issue of genetic modification and as a concern. But I would like to move on to my third question. It's very important. Covers like access and equity. Should cutting edge biotechnology treatments such as gene therapy be made available to all patients, regardless of their socioeconomic status, considering like ethical considerations as well?
That's an excellent question. And the first thing is that most health services are very cash strapped. So in my country, about 50% of people have private health insurance. And what it does is it allows you to skip the queue. So you will get on a public list, but you might be on it for many, many years. And so that becomes an issue if you've got a very painful condition or a life-threatening condition, right? So the life assurance, it could cost you maybe €300 a month for a couple. So it's significant. Then they've got all sorts of tax breaks and stuff like that. But or health service, it spends a bit differently to the NHS. So the NHS in the UK is free for everybody, but there are a lot of therapies not made available simply because the state doesn't provide the money for it. Now, it raises a very interesting issue about testing for illnesses which do have a genetic cause, such as breast and ovarian cancer. And there's been a very famous case in the US. Angelina Jolie, the actress, as you probably know, her mother and grandmother died very, very young. The mother had ovarian cancer and she died at 56. Now, that can be picked up by genetic testing in your genes. And she gave an interview to the New York Times back, I think it was 2013, in which she said that she had had the test for the BRCA gene. So if you carry the BRCA gene, it really predisposes you to breast and ovarian cancer. And she had decided for radical surgery. So she had basically her breast tissue removed and also her ovaries removed. Now, what she said, and I think it was an amazing use of her position, is that she said that she had had the money to be able to pay for the test, but that most people couldn't. And it's complex because why would a private company invest in investigating technology if it can't make money? But obviously, the existence of the patent forces the price way up because the company has a monopoly. Now, 1 month later, there was a case in which the patenting of certain genes for the BRCA test had been granted, and it was challenged in the Supreme Court, and a lot of the patents were overturned. And I read that immediately the test fell in price from $4,000 to $2,500. And that would have come way down because it meant that any company that was researching in that area could get in on the technology and produce a much cheaper test. So like there are countries like Brazil, they use a lot of generic medicine. And I don't know whether they do it in gene testing, but presumably if they're not upholding patents for the purposes of public health, then they can produce a much, much cheaper health service. But that incident, I thought it was really interesting because the interview must have influenced the judges, because she spoke very knowledgeably about the area. And I suppose spoke from a very compassionate point of view as well. So in an ideal world where we have health services that are adequately funded, then certainly there should be access for everybody. In the world in which we live, there isn't. So it does raise a question of the way in which our resources are being allocated.
I would like to move on to my another question. One question says life extension we are talking about. Should we prioritize research into biotechnology aimed at extending human lifespan? Or how might this affect societal norms and resource distribution?
Yes, the whole thing about extending our lifespan, a lot of the investment in that is from very, very rich people. So it raises a huge number of questions. First of all, with our economic situation, that an awful lot of people now are going to have to work into their pensionable age. Certainly in our country, we're doing very well economically, but the government isn't spending any money. The research into that sort of area tends to be very, very expensive. So when you've got a health service that's strapped for cash, would it not be much more ethical putting that money into palliative care, or, for example, improving the life of young people? I suppose it gets into this issue of, where we put our money. Do we put it into the elderly, or, do we invest in children's health if there is a limit? And then the other thing too is that, like, a lot of the care for elderly people, it's basically based around private nursing homes when somebody's life is extended greatly, but their mobility isn't. So I think that the lifespan is extending naturally because we've got more healthy environment, more healthy food, etc. But the questions really are in ones of mobility, stopping falling. Because as you get older and you have, elderly relatives and you're looking after them and stuff like that, actually the biggest fear for most elderly people that have got relatively good health isn't cancer and heart disease. It's actually falling, because once you've broken a bone, it affects your physical mobility so much that sometimes it takes away your independence, and that starts you on a downward spiral. So the issue of extending life, or investing in extending the lifespan, I think we need to be investing in enhancing the quality of life as people get older, because the two really go in tandem. So preventing falls, strengthening bones, that sort of research would be very, very valuable.
The wrap-up question, but very important questions is, end-of-life diseases we're talking, what role should biotechnology play in facilitating end-of-life care, such as euthanasia, and how should ethical boundaries be established?
Now, I'm absolutely delighted that you put that question in, because I teach an undergraduate class and I've actually given them an essay question, which I'm just about to correct, on the case for and against assisted dying. Now, the reason is that it's become extremely topical. So there has been an ongoing effort to introduce it in the UK. So they've just had a vote in the British Parliament, and the MPs have voted by a margin of about 50 politicians or 55 politicians to introduce assisted dying. Now, the compassionate case, I suppose, it's very much based on an individualistic human rights stories about people who are in terrible pain and that it can't be alleviated. Now, so that's been the driver, really, that people should be able to die with dignity and they should have the autonomy to determine their own life. Now, the problem is that the legislation, it falls very short for people with conditions such as multiple sclerosis, because you have to have a diagnosis of 6 months to live or less. Obviously, it's very difficult to predict. The second thing is it's very much based around a cancer model, not around diseases that kind of, I suppose, have a slow, pardon me, that have a slow burn where you're unable to predict the end. And then they say that, they've got a lot of safeguards built in. So, for example, you have to have a judge's decision, you have to have a reference from 2 doctors. But any lawyer will tell you that legislation is a living thing. So that won't stay set in stone. Like, you don't introduce a piece of legislation and anticipate that in 1,000 years it won't have been changed. So that's the first thing. I suppose the people that are against it don't look on the issue of choosing to die as an issue that should be made by individuals because there's a greater good. And people with disabilities are very, very concerned about this legislation, that they haven't really been included. So if you're on the outside judging the quality of life of people with certain disabilities, you might say, well, they'd be better off dead, but they mightn't feel that way at all. And it's sort of, in some ways, I suppose it's introducing a type of eugenics through the back door. The other thing too is that as the population gets older, there's less tax coming in, and there are people in nursing homes costing a huge amount of money. There are safeguards in the legislation about bringing direct pressure to bear on people to make this choice, but there can be insidious pressure. So people against it are saying that this should absolutely be taken off the table. It should not be there as a choice. In fact, 2 former British Prime Ministers have taken opposite views. So one is Gordon Brown. He was Prime Minister after Tony Blair. And he had a daughter who died 11 days after his wife gave birth. So he said that those were the most precious days of their life, you know, being able to spend it with somebody who, well, was going to die. But he's totally against assisted dying because he says that the life had value and it isn't for us to sort of step in. And in any case, that child couldn't make a choice. Then the other Prime Minister, or former Prime Minister, David Cameron, had a child who died at around 6, I think. And he had quite severe disabilities, and he has come out in favour of assisted dying. There's a former Archbishop of Canterbury who's in favour, and there's another one who's against. So it's a huge ethical issue. Then, you know, because Britain has quite a complex legal system, the Isle of Man, which is one of its territories, has its own parliament to debate this issue by itself. And it looks like they're going to introduce it. And the Scottish Parliament is introducing it as well. Or, sorry, it's certainly debating it. And in Ireland, we're debating the issue as well. And I suppose that there is a very strong, well, I suppose a very compassionate perspective taken on this for people who are suffering. I suppose the problem that some people see is that it gets extended then. And there was a woman in the Netherlands last year of 29 who was suffering from very severe depression. And she got the right to terminate her own life. Now, at the 11th hour, she changed her mind. But there is a big debate as to whether you treat the depression or whether you administer a pill that ends the person's suffering. And that can be obviously either mental or physical suffering. I suppose it's an area of bioethics, really. You know, the span of your life, the quality of your life, and the state's involvement. But I suppose that I would hope that most people in Europe are against the death penalty. We don't have the death penalty. It's seen as a hallmark of human rights that the state doesn't have the right to intervene and take away life. And I think that in this case, it's a hugely ethically fraught area to trust the state to take away life when, you know, the state can be wrong. It's been involved in miscarriage of justice cases, and a lot of other dubious behaviour. I've had my own campaign against our health service executive on an issue of restricting access to long-term care for people with mental illness, because one of my brothers suffers from mental illness. So we waged a long campaign against them. And we didn't come up against the most pleasant officials. And they would be the same officials that may be administering assisted dying. And I would be very, very uncomfortable with that. So even if you think that there's a right to assisted dying or assisted suicide, there's still the human element of the people who are going to administer it, the way in which it's going to be implemented, and the calculation of where we're going to put our resources when resources are limited. And I think that it's deeply problematic, because do we then decide there's a perfect person and they get the investment, whereas you get to a certain point in life where you're of no use anymore? So, you know, the state then kind of intervenes, or you come under pressure to end your life.
So thanks a lot, Dr. Marine, giving us an elaborative narrative on this much needed topic to be discussed. You've talked about it, informed consent, then you've moved on genetic modifications, access and equity, life extension, and very important end of life decisions you've talked about. Such a wonderful narrative, at the same time, body of data, scientific, research focused, academic, also well covered in your discussion, which I sense, and it's a tremendous piece of information. I'm sure audience, once watching this narrative and kind of explanation, will certainly draw benefits. It's also going to serve as a tremendous database, scientifically research, in particular in academics also. So that's what the very purpose of research sociology is, like, should have we try to look into should of making database for academics and research as well, but much focus is on research dimension and domain. But wonderful information, ma'am. Thanks a lot joining us from Ireland.